It has been a painful year.
I can't breathe. Stop moving.
1 year
I can't breathe, man.
after an officer murdered George Floyd.
Find the defendant guilty.
That officer has been found guilty.
Today, we are able to breathe again.
This verdict does give a message to his family that he was somebody, that his life mattered, that all of our lives matter.
Former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin is awaiting sentencing.
We can't stop here.
George Floyd's death
George Floyd!
not just sparking protests around the world, but change nationally and locally.
We have to focus on transforming policing in the United States.
But 1 year later, there is still work to do.
We need true justice. That's not one case. That is a social transformation that says that nobody's beneath the law and no one is above it.
What's her name? What's her name? What's his name?
Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. I'm Ginger Gadsden. Last year, as we were getting ready to celebrate Juneteenth, the day the nation commemorates the end of slavery, we were also forced to consider the inequity that still lingers in our country. Today, nearly 1 year later, we are following up on that conversation and taking a closer look at what has changed and what obstacles still lie ahead. So we have invited back some of the panelists from last year's town hall. UCF Assistant Professor of Sociology and Race Scholar, Dr. Jonathan Cox. Vanessa Skipper with the Brevard Federation of Teachers, and new this year to the panel, pediatrician Dr. Akinyemi Ajayi. Thank you all so much for joining us for this important conversation tonight. Now, we do have one programming note. Orlando Police Chief Orlando Rolone also confirmed he would be here with us tonight, but less than 2.5 hours ago, he let us know that he would not be able to make it. So we're going to be leaning on our panelists for even more answers tonight, and that gives us just a little more time for you guys to dive deeper into some of the topics that you really care about. So we have a lot to get to, and we will be answering your questions throughout the next hour of Real Talk. So if you have a question, please join the conversation. You're already here at clickorlando.com. So I do want to start with the Derek Chauvin verdict. Many waited, unsure of what the jury was going to decide following the murder of George Floyd. This is how Floyd's family and attorneys reacted to the news.
Find the defendant guilty.
Now, the verdict was read. As it was read, we also talked to a local barbershop owner who is married to an Orlando police captain. This is what Jay Henry had to say.
People are tired of seeing police officers that do wrong and get away with murder and go back out there and continue to do it again. He got everything he deserved. That was not policing. That was his behavior that got him those 3 counts. Guilty, guilty, guilty.
And I remember Jay Henry, when we talked to him, our reporter Jerry Askin was at his shop and talked to him about that day. And you could really feel his emotion and just almost a relief as he was saying. So, Dr. Cox, what was your reaction when you heard the verdict? Because I remember reading on social media, someone said it is the first time she's ever watched a case where we had all the evidence and we knew the answer, but still we were unsure of the answer. What was your reaction to the verdict?
Yeah, I think for me it was very similar, right? I definitely made time to stop and watch, right? I remember calling in my wife to say, hey, they're about to read this verdict. And for me, it was a very similar feeling. I was glad, right, that the result happened, but at the same time, there was this sense of dread that maybe once again we would not see justice here, right? Justice after the fact. And so I think I probably felt the same way that a lot of Americans, particularly Black Americans, feel, which is that this should have happened. We knew based on the evidence that this was going to go through, and he should have been given these guilty verdicts. But there was always that lingering possibility. And then beyond that, also, I was just a little, for me, it was a little dampened. My spirit was a little bit dampened, only because the reality is that not much has really changed. We still haven't seen significant change. And so I knew that while this was a great victory and a great win, we still have a long way to go.
Okay, so Vanessa Skipper, same question. What was your reaction when you heard the Derek Chauvin verdict?
I remember tuning in to the radio station as much as I could as I was traveling between sites for work, and I was able to listen to the verdict as it was read. And my initial reaction was justice was served, but I knew immediately with that reaction that the work still needed to continue, that this one verdict was not going to be the change that we needed to see, and that we all needed to continue to have these courageous conversations, to continue to move forward and work together to make the change that needs to happen. This is one case, one verdict. We've seen this happen in other cities before George Floyd, and as much as I hope that it doesn't happen again, we know that if we don't keep this up, that real change won't happen.
Yeah. And Dr. Jai, the same question for you. When you heard the Derek Chauvin verdict, what was your reaction?
Well, it was one of relief because it was something that needed to happen. The truth is, there was so much evidence. It played out in the eyes of everyone. There's hardly a person who didn't see the entire 9-minute or 10-minute affair, depending on how much video you watched. What was probably sad was it took a 10-minute video in order to convince people, and quite frankly, still a lot of people weren't convinced that even there was a verdict. Fortunately, the jury was convinced, so that was helpful. The hope now is that it doesn't take someone with a smartphone, 9 minutes recording, for us to realize that there is humanity that has to be looked at all the time. And when you do something like this, it shouldn't take this much. And really, this should never be happening in the first case. So it was one of relief for the family, for the city, and honestly for the country. We needed a break, and this was a break.
Yeah, it was very hard to watch, and you had to watch it, but you had to watch George Floyd die over and over again. And, but that was part of the case, and we were very careful here at News 6 in showing what we showed, because it was painful to relive that for so many people. So it's just, I think a lot of people were surprised that it happened the way it happened and relieved at the same time. But still, there's no need to celebrate because there's still such a long way to go. And Derek Chauvin could face up to 40 years in prison when he is sentenced, and that is coming up on June 25th. Now, the trial for the other 3 former Minneapolis officers charged in Floyd's death will move forward in 2022. The judge says he's doing that so the 3, along with Chauvin, can face civil rights charges in federal court first. And moving on, when it comes to police reform nationally, the House approved the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act back in March. It would ban chokeholds and some no-knock warrants and prohibit racial and religious profiling. But overhauling qualified immunity protections for police, which would make it easier to hold officers accountable in court, has been a non-starter for Senate Republicans, and the Senate has yet to bring it to a vote. And here in Florida, a similar measure approved by the House and the Senate, still awaiting Governor Ron DeSantis' signature. Key points to this include limiting chokeholds, requiring law enforcement agencies to track and report use of force incidents, and prohibiting officers from arresting kids under 7 years old. And I know that last part, under 7 years old, because we had a case where there was a 6-year-old taken in handcuffs from a school. So it's sad that that had to be included in that. So Dr. Cox, do you think enough change will happen without changing the laws?
So no, sadly not. And actually the truth is that much of the change that we really need to see happen at a systemic level is probably still not going to happen, even with many of the changes that have been implemented, right? And so part of the issue is that, one, there has been a lot of legislation that is flying around a lot of states and cities, local places, which is fantastic. But at the same time, a lot of it has yet to be even implemented, right? They're not even doing some of it yet. So we see that, but then also just more, what we really want to focus on is, again, the systemic changes that need to happen. And so while some of these new reforms that we're looking at, right? What we see in some states, in some cities, is that there is now being implemented a duty for officers to intervene if they see something happening. But if we don't change the culture of a lot of police departments, if we don't provide protections for people, for police officers who are blowing the whistle on the bad behavior of their colleagues or are intervening, then we know that we're just going to see some of the same things continue to happen, right? We have officers now all over the country that talk about how they have intervened, they have tried to get people to see what's going on, to see the right things that need to be happening, and they are punished for what they are doing. So again, we need to see more changes at the systemic level to really see improvement in the system.
A great point. And I can't remember where it happened. It might have been in Buffalo, but a police officer there 15 years ago was fired, lost her pension and everything because she was trying to stop her partner from performing an illegal chokehold on someone. And she's the one who got in trouble. And just recently after the Chauvin verdict, she received her pension and everything was reversed. So it is hard for them to come forward because they know there are some repercussions that could happen. Ms. Skipper, can you tell us how this would impact school systems?
Absolutely. We've seen obviously a rise of officers in our schools, especially following the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas shooting massacre. And we value the roles that school resource officers can play in building relationships and building communities within our schools. But we also recognize that sometimes these officers are used as disciplinarians in our schools, and that's not what they're there for. And so we need to really focus on getting more supports in our school systems for students who are struggling, for students who may need extra supports, whether that's behavior or academic. Arresting children can't be the first option in these cases. And unfortunately, having an officer on campus, sometimes that is what happens. So while we value the experience, we value the safety that our SROs bring to the table and the relationships that teachers and administrators and students build with them, we want it to stop right there. We want them to be a valuable part of our school community and not somebody that's there to arrest students for behavior.
Sure. And Dr. Ajay, we're getting questions from people online. One person wants to know, what do you tell patients and parents who express fear or anxiety about George Floyd's death and other instances of police violence? I would imagine that you see some of that coming into your office from kids.
It's a tough one because it's a reality for too many people too often. You hear parents say it all the time that they tell their children, behave a particular way, keep your head down, keep your hands up, make sure people can see you. A lot of people are living in a state of siege, and you want them to stop feeling that way. I think, like the last speaker mentioned, it's really good to actually have the resource officers in schools, and I think the police in general should do a really solid job of trying to create a good relationship with those children there, because that's one of the first places where they may come in contact with a police officer. And if they can build trust with that person there, that may actually be what feeds into the later situation. But it is a big issue. And, one of the things that people don't talk about enough is, even when you consider the case of George Floyd, there were a lot of children that lost their innocence, because although we may say we can control their cell phones and all, there were a lot of kids who, for the first time ever, which even a lot of adults have not seen, got to actually watch a human being die in front of them. And the question is, how have we addressed that issue to even help them realize that? And they're looking at grown-ups. The funny thing is, kids always felt like they were the ones that were most likely to get killed, that the older individuals are likely to have it easier. But now they're seeing that it doesn't matter. You could be a 40-something-year-old, you could be a 15-year-old. And they shouldn't have to live in this kind of fear. And it's kind of unfair to the good police out there too, because there are a lot of cops who do an awesome job. But I think it's going to start, again, like you said, with community relationships that are built at that level to make this work for everyone.
Yeah, and it seems like a lot of these kids, they've had their innocence stolen because they are forced to grow up so soon with the reality of what is going on all around them. On that same note, do you feel, just based on what you've observed in the past year, has it gotten better or worse in your perception?
Personally, I don't think it's gotten better. The problem is there's too much sloganism. People like to throw around terms rather than actually talk. And it starts from the top. When you look at our politicians, they don't really discuss. They like to throw slogans because slogans get attention, but it doesn't really get to the bottom of the matter. And I fear that, what happened with Derek Chauvin, for example, and what happened with George Floyd happened because there was just too much. It couldn't be put away. And you've said it yourself. Look at the reforms that aren't going through. I mean, these are common sense reforms. They're not punitive to anyone who's doing the right thing. So how can reforms that are not punitive, that would not hurt one good cop, be so hard to get through bodies that will come out and tell us how much they will pray for us and they have us in their prayers? But just do something to help human beings, keep them alive. So I don't really think it's changed at all.
Yeah, I think you're talking about the famous thoughts and prayers every time there's some sort of tragedy that happens in a community, and that really doesn't do a lot of good. We need more action to happen. Dr. Cox, same question to you. Do you feel much has changed?
No, right, and again, that's why the verdict, the Chauvin verdict was in many ways just sobering, right? It was expected, but also, right, there are a lot of things that just haven't changed, right? And so again, if we can think just about the period of time during the Chauvin trial, just in that period of time, of what I think about 60 people were killed by the police, right? Just during that. We could look at, Dante Wright. We could look at Ma'Khia Bryant, right? Both young black people who were killed by police, who were unarmed, right? In the case of Ma'Khia Bryant, she was armed, but she had actually called the police to get help because she was being attacked, right? So we're still seeing the same things happen, even in the midst of this verdict that came down. And so it's really disheartening. And then, as our last speaker was saying, that when we look at the fact that a lot of this legislation that in many ways is common sense, that is also supported with bipartisan support across America, right? The ending of qualified immunity, all these things, right? Over 40% of conservatives, conservative Americans, support the idea of ending qualified immunity. Yet it's not being done because politicians are often getting stuck in like the slogans and creating these type of barriers, right? They can thrive on that, right? And we don't actually have the change we need. And so that really ends up just making a lot of people feel the stress of this continued circumstance with systemic racism, particularly in policing, as we're talking about now.
Yeah, and it's funny you should mention, because one of our questions from clickorlando.com is about qualified immunity to you, Dr. Cox. It says, why was qualified immunity created in the first place, and what could a world without it look like?
Sure, and so qualified immunity really is just it's laws in place that make it really difficult for police officers and other state officials to be held accountable for misactions, misbehavior, et cetera, right? And this is being held accountable financially, right? So you can't sue a police officer for something that they were doing that was against the rules, against the law themselves, and seek damages in that sense, right? You end up having to sue like the city or something that's larger. And so if we end qualified immunity, what we're seeing is that actually there are many states that have been doing this. And we've seen that the sky hasn't fallen, right? As the last speaker said, right, it's not, ending qualified immunity does not hurt all of the great officers out there that are doing their jobs, right, that are doing what they're supposed to be doing in the ways that they're supposed to be doing it. And so if we look at some of the work that's done by, we could look at Dr. Rayshawn Ray, who's at the University of Maryland and the Brookings Institute. He talks about replacing qualified immunity with having police officers have insurance, police officers and precincts. And so that insurance would then help pay, because what a lot of people don't know is when we use qualified immunity, what ends up happening is that us, the taxpayers, we're the ones that end up paying for the misconduct of police, right? And there have been studies that have shown, over $2 billion worth of money was spent, taxpayer money that was spent on these types of cases. And that was just in some of the largest precincts around the country. That's not even all of them. So we could really investigate a world where this doesn't exist, and we can see it happening in states right now.
Yeah, and the one thing, I am always one of the first people to say, there are some very good officers and law enforcement out there, many of them. And so we have to recognize that on the flip side of that, not every police officer wants to kill you, but not every black person is a threat. So, we have to come to some agreement, but you have this standoff, because if you're confronted by an officer as a black person, you're looking at that officer like they want to kill you, and the officer saying, you're already a threat to me just by the skin you come in. Mm-hmm. So I feel like we have to get past that, and then we can move forward a little better as well. So since 2017, the Orlando Police Department has required new recruits to meet with people in the community they serve. Now, one new recruit telling News 6 it's a great way to get involved with the people who live in the community. And since the death of George Floyd, the city of Orlando has also hired a nationally recognized police trainer to help bridge the gap between police and the community.
We want the officers to develop rapport with the residents, not just so much as it's just police duty.
Some of them are developing relationship, but you can also tell the younger officers, you know, they're not used to Pine Hill, Mushy Drive, so they're not used to those communities. So when they go in, you can see they're uncomfortable.
Now, after months of meetings, that trainer is now making recommendations which would impact several communities, including more community-based engagement for the Washington Shores area of Orlando. And local law enforcement agencies tell News 6 recruitment is strong and there is a focus on diversity. Last year, the Seminole County Sheriff's Office hired 12 black deputies, which is the highest number it has had. This comes as the Sheriff's Office has focused on recruiting at historically black colleges and universities and added a minority recruitment and scholarship program. So how much of a difference do these changes actually make? And I'll start with you, Dr. Ajay. How important is it for police officers to know the communities in which they are policing?
I think it's really important for police officers to know the communities in which they're working. You know, it's tough when you consider the fact that how do you go to a job where you're afraid that every single person that turns a corner suddenly or turns around suddenly is trying to kill you? That's tough. Now, it's not realistic also, because you have to know that most of the people in these communities are not do not have that intent. So yes, getting to know your communities might make a huge difference just in allowing the police officers themselves to lower that level of anxiety that they may have, because that level of anxiety is probably one of the reasons why they are ending up doing some of these sudden events or shootings and then looking back and saying, oh gosh, you know, it was a pen or it was a phone, it wasn't a gun. I think you need to lower your anxiety levels in order to get to that point. Diversity helps, yes, but the truth is, I think we just need to teach civility at all levels. You know, I want police officers who, when they speak to you, don't start by yelling at you. Understand that you're an individual that they can speak to, because that helps to lower the tone. You know, they're the person of authority in that situation. So when you start a conversation by yelling or screaming at someone, you don't set a good tone. So it doesn't matter whether they're black officers or white officers or Hispanic officers. If they don't set the right tone, so their skin color isn't going to make a difference to a kid who's being stopped. It's their tone that's going to make the biggest difference. You come with a wrong tone, it doesn't matter what color you have. It's not going to make a difference.
Yeah, Mrs. Skipper, what do you think the difference would be if kids in schools had a more positive interaction with these officers before a school resource officer is called in, if they knew them in the community first?
I think that's absolutely important. I think it ties right into teachers knowing the communities in which they teach, just like police officers knowing the communities in which they serve. Really at the core of this is building relationships, right? And if you build a relationship with the people, you're going to have a better outcome in most situations. And, you know, I just want to echo my fellow panelists in saying I believe that the majority of law enforcement officers are good, and that they don't want to be a subject of this investigation. They don't want to find themselves in a situation where they make a decision, or somebody assumes they make a decision based on race. And I think by taking that time to get to know the communities, by, also I mentioned before, policing each other. We're always told, in the classroom and in our schools, if you see something, say something. If you see something that's not right, you've got to say something to your fellow officers. And if that's not working, you've got to go above them.
And Dr. Cox, same question for you, but Dr. Ajay said something interesting too. You really have to have them start with lowering the tone. Mm-hmm. How important is it that police officers reflect their communities?
It's very important, right? And so we see that there's a high incidence of police officers that don't live in the communities that they serve. And so when we think about, issues of fear, et cetera, right, that's one of the things that makes it very difficult. It's really hard to expect somebody to adequately and properly serve a community that's just full of people that they're afraid of. Right? We also know that there are issues of stereotyping that exist, right? That's why police officers, again, regardless of race, are more likely to see weapons in the hands of black people than they are white people, right? And so then that leads to some of these statistics, like black people being 3.5 times more likely to be shot by and killed by police when they're not attacking, when they don't have weapons, right? And so it's really important for our officers to be critically involved, right, at a very deep level with the communities in which they serve. Right, we also can think about the fact that when we look at the average police call, like 8 or 9 out of 10 police calls are for things that have nothing to do with violence, right? And so we're sending police out, and sometimes they may be expecting certain situations that really aren't there, right? And so it's helpful when you know who's there. You talk to people. Again, too, I was also on at one of this Orange County Task Force for police for violence in communities around Orlando. And one of the things that officers were telling us was that it's really almost always down to very few number of individuals that are the ones really causing the violent problems, right? And I'm talking about a handful of people in any given community. And so if you live in that community or you work in it enough and you know the people, then you know exactly who to go to if something is going wrong. And then everybody else becomes allies in the job that you are doing for the community too. So it's really important.
Yeah. You feel like you have an ally. That is key. So a lot of changes come as leaders in Orange County are considering limiting where people can actually picket. Commissioners recently introduced an ordinance that would prohibit people from picketing at people's homes. If adopted, it would also prevent people from picketing on public property, such as sidewalks and streets within 150 feet of the targeted person's home. Now, a summary of that ordinance says Orange County Sheriff John Mina requested the ordinance after consulting with Mayor Jerry Demings. And the ordinance would prohibit protests like the one we saw last year at Derek Chauvin's Windermere area home following the death of George Floyd. We also saw protesters take to the street throughout Florida last year. We're talking about crowds in DeLand, Daytona Beach, and downtown Orlando, demanding justice and police reform. Now, most of the demonstrations were peaceful, but some did turn violent, like the one you're seeing right now. This happened on I-4. Orlando police say protesters were throwing rocks and construction equipment, and they had to use tear gas to get protesters off the highways. You might imagine that is a dangerous situation there. But saying that people can't picket in certain areas, do you feel that goes against the very basic rights that some people feel like they have? If you don't like something, you're told in this country, okay, well, you can protest. Dr. Cox?
Yeah, so I think I would want to look in a little bit more into that specific rule. I know thinking about some of the anti-riot bill that's going out, I understand some of that a little bit more. But I think it's okay if we're saying, picketing, protesting in certain spaces, as long as you're very careful about the language so that it doesn't prevent people from being able to fully exercise their First Amendment right and engage in this type of protest. But, somebody standing at somebody's house, right, that's pretty invasive. And so we could think about that. I'm fine with understanding the implications of that. But again, you really want to think about how far does this extend, and then who then is this most going to impact, right? And so if we think about some of the anti-riot legislation that's going out, this is definitely going to impact everybody. It's going to impact right-wing protesters, right? But it's going to disproportionately impact left-wing protesters who are made up of people of color, marginalized groups, or people who are protesting against things or for people that are from marginalized groups. We're going to see that a lot more. And so that's where that slippery slope happens, where all of a sudden your rights are being taken away a little bit more at a time, and next thing you know, your First Amendment right is just kind of completely eroded.
Okay, so let's talk about the anti-rioting a little bit more. As we mentioned, Governor Ron DeSantis has not yet signed the police reform bill, but he has signed an anti-riot legislation into law. He said the measure is, quote, the strongest anti-rioting, pro-law enforcement piece of legislation in the country. Now, the measure was one of the 2021 legislative's most contentious issues. Among other things, the law increases penalties for crimes that occurred during a riot or violent protest bars the release of defendants arrested in violent protests before making their first court appearance, makes it a felony to organize or participate in a violent demonstration, and protect all monuments. Civil rights groups are challenging the legislation, saying it is nothing more than, quote, an attempt to silence the Black Lives Matter needed when we talk about laws that are already in place. So, Dr. Cox, I'll start with you once again, because, as we further examined it, there were things that were already in place to protect people from rioters and laws against doing some of the things that rioters would do. Mm-hmm. Is this anti-rioting legislation needed?
No, it's not, right? And what we see is that this really is just another dog whistle. This really is a response, right, to Black Lives Matter. Again, if we think back to last year, 2020, 11,000 protests, the vast majority of these were Black Lives Matter protests, right? Interestingly enough, though, when you look at the data on these protests, over 95% of them were peaceful. Less than 5% involved violence of any kind, right? And so we're seeing that. And so one of the things that I thought about when I was considering this anti-riot bill that's happening here in Florida is, what is this in response to that has happened in Florida? Right, even that one clip that you just showed all of our viewers, right? That's maybe the one incident where we saw a little bit of violence. We really haven't seen a ton. We haven't seen monuments being torn down and defaced. We haven't seen a lot of this stuff. And so this is very preemptive, assuming that there's going to be all this negative action that comes out when, again, the vast majority of the protests that have been happening here in Florida as well with around the country have been really peaceful. So we don't need this. We already have protections. This actually creates a lot more problems, like creating felony charges for people that are engaging in their First Amendment right. Right. And then also, too, one of the things that's not seen that I think is so problematic with this is that if I attend a protest or you attend a protest and you're peaceful, you're one of the peaceful protesters in there, if a handful of people engage in violent acts, all of a sudden you then can be charged with a felony because you were in the same place and maybe somebody could assert that you were a part of the violent protest. Right. So it's a very slippery slope, very ambiguous language that I'm really worried about where this could lead here in Florida.
Sure. And Mrs. Skipper, you have been a part of a peaceful protest. Can you tell me what you think about this legislation?
Absolutely. I agree with Dr. Cox that, largely these protests were completely peaceful. I was really, really proud of the Black Lives Matter march that was planned in Cocoa, Florida. It was done in conjunction with the Cocoa Police Department, and really we marched together. We marched with people from all walks of life, from people from all over the political spectrum, and I really have to take a pause to think, if I'm walking, I'm protesting peacefully, and maybe somebody next to me gets rowdy and, I get arrested because somebody else made a poor decision. I think there's laws out there already for destruction of property, and so I think this was largely a bigger response than was needed because, in Florida, where there were some protests, I would say the majority of people that showed up that day did not show up with the intent to cause harm to anybody or the intent to damage property.
And Dr. Ajay, would you like to weigh in on the legislation, the anti-rioting legislation, and your thoughts on that?
I think the anti-rioting legislation is, again, another unnecessary piece of legislation. There were more important things going on in this country, and there were already laws in place that in the state of Florida that could have handled everything that was going on. The truth is, I think we're beginning, I look at this sometimes and I say, we have no idea how lucky we are to live in a country where democracy is supposed to exist, where I always say every 2 or 4 years you have a right to kick a person out if they don't do what you want them to do. Not necessarily vote someone in, but kick someone out if they don't do what they're supposed to do. And also, you have the right to protest. I mean, look at countries where the right to protest has been stymied in different ways. The ultimate outcome is always poorer for everyone, including the people who think the laws work better for them today. So, maybe today you look and you say, well, this might stymie the people who are into Black Lives Matter. But what about tomorrow when it's a cause that's important to you? And what happens when you're that peaceful demonstrator who, like a lot of us have been at different times in our life, and then the person next to you goes nuts and does something really off the wall, and now you're caught up in it. So I feel like there are several issues going on. How can there be, how could we act with so much speed in a situation where we weren't even having riots? And yet we've had police brutality, we've had unnecessary shootings, we've had issues to do with COVID-19 in this past year, and we've got those issues dragging, and yet we're able to pull up a law where there was no law needed and suddenly put it in place. I think sometimes we just do stuff to make it seem like we're doing stuff when it doesn't really matter. And we're not just hurting one group of people, we're ultimately hurting everyone. And people are giving up their liberties and losing their liberties without even realizing it.
We're past the halfway point now. It's going by so quickly. But Dr. Cox, before we move on, someone sent this in on clickorlando.com. They want to know how police determine, and I hope you know the answer, maybe you don't. They want to know how police determine the difference between a protest and a riot.
Yeah, and that's part of the problem with some of this language, right? Is that it's the way these laws, these bills are written, often leaves that determination largely up to whoever it is that's making the decision in the moment, right? The local law enforcement agents that are on the ground. And so that can be great if that person has a really good understanding of the differences that exist and is able to delineate very clear lines. But if they don't, or if they have a certain belief against one group or another, then that can really play into the decision that they're making. And so that it ends up being really problematic. And I think that question really also speaks to just this broader idea of what do we consider to be, violence, right, at these protests? I really get bothered, we'll say, by the language that people use when they talk about violence happening at these protests, when violence is really, most people understand violence as something that happens between people, right? I do something to hurt another individual. It's not property destruction, and that's typically what we're seeing. If I burn down a building, nobody's in it, that's not violence. That is property destruction, right? And so that just, even those kind of the ambiguous language in the ways these laws are written, it becomes really problematic. And so there's not really a clear line between what's a riot and what's a protest. There's not something you can bank on. And so you could get caught up very easily on either side of that.
Sure. News 6 is continuing the conversation on race and policing through a new initiative called Solutionaries. Solutionaries is a show that highlights the creative solutions for the major issues we're facing as a community and as a country, and how people can get involved in finding those solutions. News 6 investigative reporter Louis Bolden previews the very first episode.
Coming up on this episode of Solutionaries, policing in the 21st century. He was arrested by Daytona Beach police, and he is the chief of the same department.
You cannot teach common sense.
Two paths that would not typically cross.
They could stop it.
But on Solutionaries, they find common ground.
I agree with them 150%.
I'm Louis Bolden. This is Solutionaries.
I'm so excited to see the rest of it. I think the program is about an hour long, and it really does a deep dive into finding solutions to what's happening between the police and the community. And police reform was a major focus following, of course, the death of George Floyd. Activists also focused on voting rights, education, health inequities, and so much more. So we want to cover some of those topics with our panelists as well tonight with the time we have left. So if you are just joining us here on clickorlando.com, thank you so much. We are talking about what has changed since George Floyd was murdered at the hands of a Minneapolis police officer, and the work that still needs to be done in this country. It's a conversation we started last year on Juneteenth, and it continues today as Juneteenth 2021 approaches, which is this Saturday. And we're speaking with UCF Assistant Professor of Sociology and Race Scholar, Dr. Jonathan Cox tonight, Vanessa Skipper with the Brevard Federation of Teachers, and pediatrician Dr. Akinyemi Ajayi. So thank you all for staying with us. And let's start with voting. As the presidential election approached, activists turned their attention to getting out the vote. NBA teams like the Orlando Magic turned arenas into polling places. And despite the pandemic, more people voted than ever before, record numbers. And just months later, after praising Florida's election process, Governor Ron DeSantis signed off on a massive overhaul of the state's election process. It restricts where and when ballot drop boxes can be used, who can drop off your ballot, and adds new identification requirements. Supporters say it is all about security. Opponents, however, say the changes make it harder for Black people and other minority groups to vote. Florida is just one of a growing list of states that have passed more restrictive voting laws over the last several months. So we want to start with UCF professor and News 6 political analyst Jim Clark. We talked to him, and he calls the Republican push to overhaul the voting process in Florida counterproductive. Here's why.
The problem for the Republicans is that the election system they have worked for the Republicans. In the last election in 2018, Ron DeSantis won because of the drop box ballots. If there had been no drop boxes, he might well have lost the election. So in limiting things, it's going to be interesting to see which party gets hurt. The Republicans thought they were hurting the Democrats, but there's absolutely no guarantee of that.
So it does seem counterproductive. What message does this send to people who work to make their vote count in the middle of a pandemic? We'll start with Dr. Ajay. What message do you think that sends, that people worked so hard to protect themselves to stay safe during a pandemic, went out to vote, and then you have this happen?
I mean, I have to say, this is terrible. It makes absolutely no sense at all. Democracy is something to be cherished. I come from Nigeria, which is a country where democracy is not anywhere close to the level that it is over here. And I moved to America over 20 years ago, and it's one of the things that I always marveled about. That ability to vote people in and out and watch politicians shake hands on the way in and on the way out. Understanding that power was not theirs to keep, but power was something that we gave to them, and when we chose to take it away, we could take it away from them. I never thought I would get to the day when we would get to the point where we're trying so hard to make it hard for people to do those actions. Now, people tend to forget that what's a majority today may become a minority tomorrow. And what might seem advantage today becomes a disadvantaged population tomorrow. When you set laws in place that disadvantage people or are set in place to disadvantage people, because the last election cycle was an excellent one in Florida, what tends to happen is that things tend to lead to bad outcomes for everyone else. When you tie up the election process the way you have, and you make it seem as though something has gone seriously wrong with an election and now you're going to tighten it up, the question that always comes to my mind is, if there were 20 different elections on a ballot, how is it that you can single out one or two and say those were not legitimate, but everything else is? The very people who are sitting in the offices trying to change these laws and all, were all voted in on those same ballot papers. Yet they're saying that election was not necessarily secure, but their vote was on that election ballot, and so were the others. So why do they think they are legitimate and should even be sitting in office if they're saying that that same ballot paper did not count well for every election in place, and as such they want to change all the rules for everyone at this point? And that's nationwide.
We asked that question, and the answer we got was it was lower on the ticket, not where they were. So, Mrs. Skipper, what do you have to say about that when you realize that so many people did all they could to vote and remained careful and safe? What does it say?
Well, it's interesting. My first presidential election in the state was the year of the hanging chads. I've watched from that moment to this moment how much change has happened in Florida. And just like you said, Governor DeSantis lauded our election system, bragged that we were able to report our numbers by the end of election night, and that we had no problems. So when I look at a law like this, I'm wondering why we are, again, solving a problem that wasn't actually a problem. All of us, whether we're Republicans, Democrats, Libertarians, somewhere in between, I believe that most of us really believe that everybody should have access to voting. And making it harder will disenfranchise people from all walks of life. And during a pandemic, when we were all trying to figure out what's safe and what's not safe, and we were all trying to make decisions that were right for our families, to pass a law like this that would basically say, if you want to vote, you've got to risk your life a little bit more. I just think, it was solving a problem that didn't exist.
And Dr. Cox, what is your opinion on the changes?
I'm right in agreement with the other panelists, right? I think this is a problem that did need to be solved. I think it's very interesting that a lot of these conservative politicians that are trying to push through these laws in various states, right, they did not claim that there was insecurity in the election when they won, right? So I think that's a huge thing. And so to me, this represents not only a problem that doesn't need to be solved, right, but it's creating a problem. We are running the clock back. We're pushing more towards more voter suppression, right, where a lot of activists have actually been calling some of these laws a renewed form of Jim Crow, right? And so these are it's making it much more difficult for people to vote. And to me, this is it's a major problem when we think about this country being a democratic country that is, as the other panelists said, a hallmark of what democracy is everybody should have the right to vote, and it should be the easiest thing that they need to do in their life.
All right, so now we want to talk about something that almost everyone is talking about, and that's education. Last week, the State Board of Education unanimously passed a new rule changing how history is taught in Florida public schools. The measure bans teaching critical race theory, even though it's not even on the curriculum. And Dr. Cox, you define CRT as a theoretical perspective and practice for examining the role of race and racism in society. Governor DeSantis, who favors the new ban, calls CRT toxic and says it could cause divisions. And this is what he had to say about it.
Let me be clear, there's no room in our classrooms for things like critical race theory. Teaching kids to hate their country and to hate each other is not worth 1 red cent of taxpayer money.
And I'm going to let you take it away, Dr. Cox.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just an absurd statement, and we see this over and over again with a lot of the, it's really mostly conservative politicians who are pushing against this. And again, this is a problem that doesn't need to be solved, right? Critical race theory, for one, is not being taught in K through 12 schools. And then also, again, it's a perspective. It doesn't teach anybody to hate anybody else. It doesn't teach you that you are inherently a part of an oppressed group or oppressors, right? In fact, critical race theory helps you understand that nothing is inherent about our country, right? We have to think about the social and historical construction of everything that we are seeing and experiencing now. And race is one of the biggest social constructions that we see. It's a made-up concept. It has there's no biological or genetic basis to it, right? It is something we have made up. And so to hear, Governor DeSantis and others talking about how this is creating divisions, no, it's not creating divisions. And actually, if you use critical race theory the way it's supposed to be used, it could help you disband many of the disparities that exist and help to create an understanding amongst folks that leads to greater connection between people that doesn't actually separate you.
And don't you think bringing it up and saying it will not be taught in Florida schools has just made people more curious as to what it actually is?
Absolutely, right, and I mean, in some ways, maybe that's a good thing. Although I think we could have gotten there without this particular law. But we do want people to know, because this is a very useful theory. Again, it's simply just a perspective that helps you understand the role of race and racism in society, right? That is literally it. And so people that are saying things beyond that, I just would encourage them to do a little bit more digging into some of the research and the work that has been done by critical race theorists.
And Mrs. Skipper, what do you say about that?
I absolutely agree. I think that this was another solution to a problem that doesn't exist. Critical race theory is not mentioned in the Florida state standards. It's not mentioned in our statute. And, unfortunately, what's happening is that we're seeing our politician politicize the teaching of history in our classrooms. I've taught alongside teachers who are Republicans, Democrats, Libertarians, somewhere in between, and I have never once thought that my colleagues were indoctrinating students. And so when Governor DeSantis had his opening statement before the state board and he talked about teachers indoctrinating students, he put us all in one group. And I really think in that moment, there was an effort to pit teachers against one another. There was an effort to pit our communities against our public schools. And we have politicized a term that people don't understand. I'll recommend what I recommend to parents, and students and people who may challenge, a book they're not sure of. You can't challenge something you have never read. You can't challenge something that you don't understand. And I would challenge everybody to take a moment, step back from the politics, step back from the rhetoric, step back from the dog whistles, and take the time to read and understand, because coming together, understanding, thinking critically, having conversations, that's something that every educator encourages students in our classrooms. We present the material and we encourage them to think for themselves and come to their own conclusions.
Okay, so we have less than 10 minutes left and time is just flying by and we want to continue on. So meantime, Central Florida school districts are working to integrate more lessons focused on local trailblazers in the Black community. The Brevard School Board unanimously approved a resolution requiring social studies curriculum to be developed surrounding the Moores, and the Brevard County Federation of Teachers and the Harry T. and Harriet V. Moore Cultural Complex have formed a new partnership in educating students on this couple. The civil rights leader died after someone bombed their home in Mims. This happened on Christmas Eve in 1951. Their murders were never solved, and rumors swirled it was likely the work of the KKK. And a bill signed by Florida governors last summer requires students to learn about the Ocoee massacre in school, and that information about the November 2nd, 1920 riots that saw dozens of Black men killed and lynched for simply trying to exercise their right to vote to be displayed in museums around the state. So is this helpful? Because I feel like a lot of people have never heard of the Moores from Mims. I did not learn of that story until our reporter Nikki Zizaza did a story on it during Black History Month. So, Ms. Skipper, how is something like this, the Ocoee massacre, and learning about the Moores, is that helpful?
It absolutely is helpful. We are so excited about the partnership with the Moore Center. And if you've never been to the Moore Center in Mims, I encourage you to go. There's a great book written called Before His Time. Harry Moore and Harriet Moore were martyrs of the civil rights movement. They're the original martyrs. We're used to hearing about Martin Luther King Jr. and Medgar Evers and Malcolm X. But these individuals worked together to register over 116,000 Black people to vote in Florida, and that's huge. And because of their activism, because of Harry Moore's pushback on lynchings, the Brevard County School Board fired him, and we were thrilled that they recognized them both as educators. When our students learn about the Moores and when our students get to visit the Moore Center, our students of color are going to see heroes of the civil rights movement that look like them. And all of our students are going to be able to work together to understand just how important this movement was in Brevard County. I think sometimes when we learn history, it's so far removed because it's in another area, it's in another state. This is our hometown. And I'm really excited that very soon an entire generation of Brevard County students will know who the Moores are, and hopefully we'll pass that legacy on to their families and their friends and their children.
And it really is a hard story to hear when you learn that even after they were murdered, the florist in the town didn't even want to send flowers or couldn't be hired to send flowers to the funeral. That's just how deep that ran. So I encourage everyone to find Nikki Zizaza's story on clickorlando.com, because it really is an education and it is heartbreaking. All right, so for many, the last year has been very tough. A recent study by the assistant professor at the University of Utah in Salt Lake City found Black Americans reported an increase in poor mental health days. And Oviedo-based therapist Pernell Bush said over the past year, he has seen an 80% jump in more Black men seeking therapy at his office.
Today, I had a man that just came in for the first time and he was just in tears.
Black people in America have trauma that America has caused, and we have to unpack it, and we got to work through it.
I have seen individuals come into my office with concerns such as just being discouraged, being anxious, feeling insignificant. It's okay to disconnect. It's okay to allow yourself to process, and it's okay to get into a community or support circle that you feel safe with.
And Dr. Ajay, I will start with this question for you. How important is it? Because it is difficult for Black men in particular to ask for help because somehow it makes them think it seems weak. It does not. How important is it to get mental health?
It's very important to get mental health care in general. It actually feeds into not just mental health with black men in general, but actual physical health in addition to mental health. We don't do enough of it. We don't go to doctors enough. We don't seek help enough. This past year has been tough because even for the people who seek help, most of the help has been their community. And with this pandemic and people social distancing and wearing face masks and washing and staying distant from each other, although these were all done for the right reasons, and it's awesome that we did them, the reality of it is that it also created a level of detachment, which has made it more difficult for people to seek help or reach out or talk to the people that they normally would talk to. So I'm not surprised that there have been more people who reported difficulties just because we haven't had as much contact and the ability to have contact, and they have turned to professionals, which is quite good and hopefully something that continues as a trend. I think it's worth applauding and should be continued.
Absolutely. So, Dr. Jacques, can you tell people who might not even know where to start, what kind of help can people find if they are struggling during this time? Because a lot of people are struggling.
So, there were lots of different organizations that are willing to help, and individuals. I always say you really should look for your church. Your churches are a good starting place, especially in the black communities. The churches are amazing places to get started with when you're looking for support or help in the first case. But when you're talking about professional help, you really want to look for your mental health workers. You want to look for your clinical psychologists, people that you can speak to that can actually begin to let you know a bit more about what's going on, people that you can relate to, but more importantly, people you can feel safe with. Because I think people need to understand that when they come vulnerable to someone else, they need to know that that vulnerability is between them and their professional and not between someone else. And that's why even though we will say, yes, talk to your ministers and stuff like that, you really should look for professional help, because then you know that you can say whatever you need to say and know that it is a safe, secure space for you to be in all the time.
Yeah, that is really good advice. And I'm looking at the clock, and we have less than a minute and a half left. And I'm so sorry that we've run out of time. It's been such an insightful conversation. I've so enjoyed it. So last year, I left you with this quote, and it's from author Zora Neale Hurston's book, Their Eyes Were Watching God. It was, "There are years that ask questions and years that answer." And I feel like this year we're getting some of the answers, but we still need much more. And hopefully together we can get those answers, but it's going to take all of us to do it. So I do want to thank all of you for joining us. UCF Assistant Professor in Sociology and Race Scholar Dr. Jonathan Cox, Vanessa Skipper with the Brevard Federation of Teachers, and pediatrician Dr. Ekenyemi Ajay. We really appreciate your time, and we leave you with a look back at some of the moments from last year.